end the recession, and pay down the debt. Peruse the Revival Resolution, discuss it, share it, and make it part of the national debate. Joseph A. Bagnall, narrator. Consider the words of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the crisis of the Great Depression.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
The Revival Resolutions, submitted by Joseph A. Bagnall, adjunct in history, Palomar College, San Marcos, California. Whereas in 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed the office of president, the unemployment rate had reached 24.9%, bank failures had reached well over 9,000, home mortgages were being foreclosed at roughly 1,000 per day, and 1 out of 3 families had no income at all, and whereas by 1938, a majority in Congress demanded an end to further New Deal experimenting, insisting we had exhausted our capacity to engage in excessive government spending, and whereas at this juncture, government debt was roughly 43% of GDP, and our unemployment rate was about 19%, and whereas most of the 19% who were listed as unemployed in 1938 were working for subsistence wages in New Deal programs such as Public Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. These government work projects created purchasing power for workers and increased sales for businesses. They also alleviated mass suffering, preserved millions of homes, and held the line against complete economic collapse. And whereas by 1938, Congress seemed convinced that increased New Deal spending was unsustainable, and whereas by 1940, the Congress provided funding for the first peacetime draft in American history and began significant financial support for the British stand against Hitler. And whereas government spending in World War II accumulated until the debt ratio to GDP peaked at 120%, and whereas spending in World War II amounted to approximately 6 times the amount spent on the entire New Deal, and whereas in current dollars the expenditures for World War II would be measured in the trillions, and whereas it took the equivalent of trillions of current dollars to decisively resolve the Great Depression and win World War II, and whereas by 1944, government spending for World War II brought the unemployment rate down to 1.6%, and whereas President Dwight D. Eisenhower helped maintain post-World War prosperity with the Federal Highway Act, which was the largest federal public works project in American history, and also the St. Lawrence Seaway Project. And whereas the Federal Highway Act and the St. Lawrence Seaway Project gave lucrative contracts to businesses and good wages to workers, improved our infrastructure, and helped maintain a low unemployment rate of about 5%. And whereas the Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush era featured tax cuts for the rich with the attendant loss of revenue, large annual deficits, and a tripling of the national debt under Reagan and a doubling of the debt under George H.W. Bush, and whereas the Clinton administration and a Democratic Congress raised taxes on the wealthy, cut military spending by 25%, and thereby created a $4,000 billion surplus in the United States Treasury, a reduction in annual deficits, and a reduction in the debt to GDP ratio from 66.1% to 56.4%. And whereas the Clinton administration created 15 million new jobs and a U.S. economy that expanded by 50%, and whereas President Clinton reduced unemployment rates to 4% and presided over the longest peacetime economic boom in United States history, and whereas after 2 years in office, President Clinton had a Republican Congress that focused on negative aspects of his private life and impeached him, yet he still left office with a 65% approval rating, the highest of any departing post-World War II president. And whereas the George W. Bush years featured tax cuts for the rich, with the attendant loss of revenue, large annual deficits, and a 76% increase in the national debt, and whereas the debt to GDP ratio under George W. Bush climbed to 83%, and whereas in early 2011, bailout and stimulus spending has pushed the debt to GDP ratio to 94%, and whereas unemployment in early 2011 approximates 10%, and whereas in 2011 the American infrastructure is in decay, American families are suffering, and the American workforce is painfully underutilized, now therefore we highly resolve to vigorously use the federal spending models that were employed in the Great Depression, World War II, and the Eisenhower years to repair and rebuild the national infrastructure. While our current debt to GDP ratio is an enormous 94%, we met the crisis of World War II with the necessary revenue and increased the debt to GDP ratio to 120%. We shall meet our current economic crisis by challenging the current Chinese commitment of 9% of their budget to the buildup of their infrastructure with a similar United States commitment to the repair and buildup of our infrastructure. We shall focus new spending priorities on development of public transportation, high-speed rail, solar energy, wind power, and the repair of roads, bridges, schools, and other public places that currently are in decay. We further resolve to create huge federal contracts that will directly benefit American businesses and American workers who are located on American soil. We also resolve to rid ourselves of the Reagan-Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, which have resulted in enormous benefits for the few, without significant benefit for American workers. The rationale for these tax cuts has been that enormous capital surpluses were needed to invest in new businesses and create new jobs. In reality, huge capital surpluses have been invested in other countries where the wealthy can maximize their profits at the expense of suffering American workers. A tax increase on the wealthy can provide more national revenue with the attendant advantages of less borrowing from China and other countries and a reduction of our enormous debt. End notes. The first footnote. Data are from Banking and Monetary Statistics, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, 1943, pages 18 and 283. The second footnote, data are from the Fifth Annual Report of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, 1937, page 4. Photo credits. Image courtesy of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, Hyde Park, New York. Second image courtesy of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, Abilene, Kansas.